Please join the conversation. We are going to be looking at harnessing the potential of technology and data to drive worldwide initiatives aimed at empowering underserved communities. This is extremely important. I was just in Kigali, Rwanda, for the first Inclusive FinTech Forum in June with Alevandi, and there's a lot of innovation happening in this space, and it's incredibly important to look at that angle. So this session specifically will highlight innovative approaches and successful case studies that use data-driven strategies and cutting-edge technology to promote inclusivity in social, economic, and digital spheres. So help me welcome Marina Dimova, Global Director, Financial Industry and Network Advocacy for Women's World Banking.
Hello, everyone. How are you all doing? Thank you so much for joining us today. I have an incredible pleasure to welcome our panel today, where we'll be focusing on a really important topic, powering inclusion and using tech and data to power global efforts to address the underserved. And in order to do that, we have a panel of exceptional thinkers who will lend their unique perspective and expertise on this topic. So let's welcome Wenhui, Deputy Managing Director, Business Development, Tenpay Global Management and Tencent, Mara Balestrini, Digital Transformation Lead at IDB Lab, Tudi Muelo Katula, advisor to the board of Alevandi, and Professor Robert Wartrop, Chief Executive Officer at RegGenome. Excellent. So, as a product designer, I believe we live in truly exciting times. Every day, it seems a new technology breakthrough is revolutionizing and disrupting the way we live. From generative AI to Web3 to digital assets, there is so many possibilities. But really, does everyone benefit from them? Currently, we have 1.4 billion people around the world that do not have access to any digital financial services. And let's put that in perspective. We have 742 million women that don't have access as well. If we think about the number, this is really the third largest country in the world. So really, it's not only about pushing technology forward, but really thinking about what barriers we currently have to engaging the underserved communities around the world and how we can push technology forward to get us to a place that is much better than where we are right now. So with that, I would love to get started. And my first question is to Tudi. So from your experience in the Africa context, how do you define the underserved? And where has Africa made progress so far in reaching these communities? And what role do you think technology has in moving us forward?
Thank you for the question. So it's good to be here. ESG stage. We are all thinking about the E part of things being environment. We want to speak about the S part of it, the social part, which is actually really touching people. I mean, talking about Africa is underserved people that have no access to any banking services. What is the number we are talking about? Mm-hmm. Some of you may not know how big is Africa. First of all, Africa is not one country. Africa is 54 countries. I don't know how many countries you have in Asia, but I do believe it is less than 54. And Africa is 1.4, I believe, billion people. Out of those 1.4 billion people, I think only 400 million actually have access to banking services, meaning that there is a huge gap for those that cannot access banks. And we know that for the economy, if you don't have access to banking services, you are missing something. Technology. Technology in Africa make it possible for over 700 million of people to have access to mobile money accounts. On one hand, banks are able to serve 400 million people. There are more or less 400 million accounts in banks in Africa. But technology is able to serve almost double the number of people. This is how technology is impacting the continent. Looking at now transactions, because it's one thing to say, okay, maybe technology is giving access, but end of the day, it's all about transaction. How am I able to actually pay, save, and invest? We have over 1.2 trillion or billion of transactions happening through mobile money. So if you're asking me how technology is actually impacting life of people in Africa, my simple answer will be the impact is huge, the need is big, and what I want people here to understand, we are just at the beginning. Because the different solutions that are today available are mainly focusing on payment. Okay? We have payment solutions, but do we have solution to save? Very limited. Do we have solution to invest? Very limited. But we have also data. So now I would like to know who in the audience is able to come on the continent, take those data, and now create new solution for the wider audience. That will be my answer to your question.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tudi. And a really important point here is going beyond payments, really looking from the perspective of holistic needs that customers have and how to address them in a meaningful way using technology. Now let's hop off to Latin America, where Mara has been focusing on work at the IDB Lab to foster entrepreneurial innovation. So Mara, could you tell us a little bit about the financial inclusion innovations that you see really coming up in Latin America? And even beyond that, you shared with me that beyond financial services, your lab is focusing on technology that is going beyond to other sectors like health. So let's see the full picture and how it's all coming together to drive better lives for people in Latin America.
So thank you. IDB Lab is the innovation laboratory of the Inter-American Development Bank. We're the main source of development finance for Latin America and the Caribbean. Within the IDB Lab is the venture arm. We are a fund administered by the group. And what we do is, for the last 30 years, we have been investing in early stage innovators who are using innovation, disruptive technologies to address development needs in the region. 30 years ago, there was basically no VC in Latin America and the Caribbean. And we have been helping to create the VC ecosystem in LAC. Now, when we started, 80% of our portfolio was in financial inclusion. But us, and in particular, focusing on microcredits, for example. Now, fast forward 20 years, and what's happened is that technology has become increasingly embedded into everyday life. Everything has become digitized. And with this, what we've seen is that basically the emergence of embedded finance and financial products into every other form of innovation. So For example, you may have a solution that's specific to farmers and includes digital payments, or you'll have a new app that is a digital wallet, but then also gives access to loans. And so this has meant that we began to diversify our portfolio, and now we invest in 5 verticals, financial inclusion being one of them, but we also have agriculture, essential infrastructure services, health, education, talent, and employment. And of course, what we're seeing is that these innovations that had embedded finance using digital technologies, because they are much more specific, they can be a lot more impactful. So we have solutions for farmers, for example, in rural areas who had who were unbanked, but also had very little capacity to access credit. We have new apps serving migrant communities who had difficulties accessing, didn't have credit history, and so on. And with this, obviously, we are much better in terms of delivering impact in the region because we can address different pressing development challenges.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Mara. And I love how you started talking about specific segments. So who are really the underserved, and how can we dig deeper into that as we think about what technologies, but also what solutions they need in order to meet their needs? Wenhui, I'm going to move to you now. And really, the first question I want to ask of you is, who is the underserved customer for Tencent Financial Technology? And then, really, what are the specific technologies you're deploying to help engage with them? And even more specifically, can we dig into the case of cross-border payments in a little bit more detail?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, indeed, it's a very good question, right? How shall we define underserved or unmet customers? So, I'd like to mention our corporate slogan. We call it tech for good, value for users. So how do we define underserved or unmet customers? I think from each corporation, the answer is, are we bringing the values to the users? If we do, then that means we do find someone who is underserved, or at least they have needs not yet met, right? And of course, today, if Tencent is one of the leading tech group from China, we do a lot of different ideas, innovations in different areas. Well, I'm focusing on the payment side. I'd like to bring the things a little bit back to 10 years ago. All right. Today, a lot of people in this area, we use mobile phones. All right. We scan the QR code to make payments. But by, let's say, 10 years ago, actually, QR code payment was not something recognized by the industry. So we were one of the pioneers to start this initiative and eventually build it from scratch to be the, I would say, the dominant payment tools right now. Right. We also see very happily to see that it's not only for China, while we are being one of the leading markets for this kind of innovative payments, but for the rest of the region, right? If I do have the honor to speak a bit on behalf of the Asia, right? In the whole Southeast Asia regions, we see a lot of countries are moving into the QR payments, and it makes a lot of difference to our day-to-day lives. Again, if we back to 10 years ago, when we think about the payment landscape in China, it looked like fantastic. We didn't really have that much so-called underserved banking customers, because almost technically everyone could have a bank account with a bank card. But does that mean it's fully served or well served? Right? Looking at what's happening today, we are using the QR payment for almost everything. You never thought that you would be able to make an electronic payment via a mobile, but it happens every day. Right? Even you go on the street, even you go to very far end of the rural areas, you still will be able to make a payment. And it does make a big change to the day-to-day life. And also think about all those small street merchants, right? Those are usually underserved by traditional financial sectors. It's not that the financial institution didn't want to serve them, but they were lack of the capability to serve them, right? As you don't have the data, how can you prove this is the right segment you want to go? But once we introduce the electronic payment, things has changed with the QR payments. All the cash payments now converted as a digital transaction. Eventually, it became a proof of your credit, right? Then you can go to the financial institutions, give them all the proofs, then they will be able to give you the credit. That makes everyone's life better. So this is where, as part of the Tencent Group, I personally feel proud of it. And as part of the Asian community, I'm quite proud of what the Asians are doing today here. And if we are talking about the remittance as one of the cross-border business we are doing, there are a couple of interesting things. You know, as you just mentioned at the opening, when we talk about all those ladies, right? We talk about the woman economy. 6 years ago, in Hong Kong, we started one initiative to serve the domestic helpers in Hong Kong to help them send the money back to Philippines and to Indonesia. Why we came up with this idea? Because when we look at what we try to understand each and every segment's day to day, we realize for the domestic helpers, every week they may only have 1 day off, but they may need to queue 4 to 5 hours just in order to send money back to their families, which to them is essential because they do have their families, their kids, they are waiting for the support, right? So, but how can we use our technology to make their life better? So we came out with the idea to say, hey, why don't we leverage our WeChat Hong Kong wallet, right? We enable all the 7-Eleven outlets across the whole island. So for all the domestic helpers, they can easily go to the outlets to top up the wallet, then they can send the money back. But it's not only to so-called use new technology to make things happen, but it's also how can we combine with existing infrastructures to make it available for eventually the end users, right? So it's not necessarily you say, hey, mobile would be the best. No. We use a mobile in Hong Kong to make the money sent. But we also connect with the traditional networks in the country, like the pawn shops, to make their families feel comfortable to go to the place that they can just easily collect the money as they used to do. So this is a way I think technology can make a change and eventually improve the quality of life, and also help us to find the so-called underserved segment and make everyone feel better.
Thank you so much, Wenhui. And what I really took out of your answer is two things. First, challenging us to define the underserved not as people that don't have bank accounts, but people that have unmet needs, and really focusing on understanding those needs and addressing them. The other piece is around how we can leverage technology to build on innovation so they can further push new discoveries. So making payments happen, then using payments as a proof to take loans is a fantastic example. And with that, I'd like to turn to Robert, and I'd love to hear your perspective on unmet needs at the industry level and thinking how academia and research, in particularly primary research, can really push the boundaries and what's possible and how to commercialize it and bring it into the private sector.
Yeah, I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about, it builds on some of these comments and deploying technology. It's terrific that we have a large group of people, hundreds of millions in Africa, that are now connected to the system, right? The problem is you have technology and cultural developments going on that are resulting in a massive escalation of fraudulent activity. And at the same time, you have a vulnerable group because they're new players in the connected system. So they're super vulnerable. So you have to kind of address the other side of the coin. How do you use technology to acquire and analyze data for actionable insight to mitigate the risk that those newly included people face? Because the problem is, if you don't do that, they're going to check out. They're going to think it's just not worth being connected to the system because I got scammed. And I got scammed badly. And they're vulnerable, right? They're living thinly. Now, the way we have used technology in the Cambridge Centre for Alternative Finance to address this is to move from reactive in terms of, particularly from the regulator's perspective. The way regulators work is they react to events. And the problem is things happen so fast that by the time they're reacting to event, the bad guys have moved on, right? So they never catch up, really, you know, in mitigating this risk and addressing fraudulent actors. So how do you move from reactive to predictive? So the Cambridge Subtech Lab builds public good tools with funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for regulators, with the regulators, for example, to web scrape and use machine learning to look for patterns in social data. On Facebook, on Instagram, where they can see patterns of likely fraudulent activity emerging as an early warning sign, then provide a chatbot that enables people who may not normally have access channels to complain to just send a message to the regulator saying, I've been scammed or this happened, and the awareness is higher because there was this screening, horizon scanning going on before that. And then if there's an intervention or an enforcement action by the regulator against an institution that's fraudulent, the problem is they keep repeating often, right? And once they've been dealt with, then they do it again and again and again. Can you actually track the post behavior to actually make sure that that behavior isn't repetitive? So it's really about acquisition, analysis, actionable insight, moving from reactive to predictive. And I think the regulators play a really big role. And just to close on the second part about the technology and the transfer, you know, within the university, we've really had to understand how to work with, let's call it the private sector, in some cases regulators, and how do we effectively, using frameworks in Cambridge around IP licensing, what's public good, what's private good. You need a very effective framework within institutions that are creating and working with primary knowledge to be able to apply that effectively in an applied way, right? And I think, Mara, we were talking earlier about certain countries, certain universities have done that really well. Some have done it really, really poorly. I don't know if any of you are working in universities or in the academic world, but if you don't have that transfer, formalized transferring structure, to be able to take that primary research and manifest it in applied research and actually applications along the lines of what I described, everything will be stillborn in the primary research area. So you've got to unlock it, right? And a lot of that is structural. So I would encourage you, if you're in universities, start pushing for formal structures on IP licensing, or what is being created is going to stay locked up.
Thank you, Robert. A keyword that Robert mentioned is data, and really using that to drive predictively innovation in terms of where the trends are and what we need to do, both in terms of new products, but also where the risks are and how to mitigate them before people lose trust in the system, especially folks that are new entrants to it. And with that topic on trust, I want to move to a segment that's very special to my heart as somebody that works at Women's World Banking, which is underserved women. So Maura, I will start with you. Really the question is, traditionally, financial products and services have presented disproportionate barriers to women customers. And there is a mounting evidence that unless we do things differently, new entrants into technology might perpetuate or extend that gap. So how could we be in front of this, and what could we do with technology to really reach women effectively, build trust into the system, and provide products and services that really work for them?
It's a topic that is very dear to my heart too. I would say three things, just to keep it short. So the first one is that you obviously, diversity is key if you really want to have inclusion. And so for us, we increasingly look at who are the funders that we support. And we're looking at, so it's no point for us to support a startup that is claiming that's doing something for gender equality, and then there are no women in the board. So one thing that we started to measure is whether there are women in the board and the gender balance in the structure of the company. So that's one first thing that I believe in the long run will definitely have an impact. And that's data. We started collecting data about the composition of the company, and with that data, we can do a lot of things. We can do assessment, but we can also have an idea of how things are changing or not. And the second aspect is, of course, 40% of our operations must tackle the gender gaps. So in our portfolio, we increasingly see projects that are aimed at the inclusion of women in financial services, but a lot of other things. Like, for example, we have a project called We Count, and it's a very special project because what it does is it's a financial inclusion project, but where women own the data that they can lend to financial institutions to perform credit assessments on them. Typically, you're blind regarding the data that is being used to perform a credit assessment of your worthiness, of your credit worthiness. So there's really something very powerful about getting access to your own data, and being able to act on that data so that financial institutions can perform can decide on whether you have access or not to certain things. And it does something, projects like that do something that's very important, that's upskilling. So most of us have no idea what personal data of us other organizations have. We have very little awareness of that, let alone how that data is being used. And in many cases, the data could be used against you. We fund a lot of innovations that are using alternative data sets to perform credit worthiness assessment, specifically tackling women. And we also have a number of solutions trying to reduce the gender gap in employment. So they're specifically tackling gender biases in the AI systems used by recruiters. The third thing that I wanted to share is that in the past 10 years, we have seen that most of the innovations that we are investing in use artificial intelligence. And this is great because they can do a lot of things that they couldn't do in the past, but it could also potentially increase biases against women. So obviously our mission is to foster innovation for inclusion. We cannot be funding AI systems that may create more exclusion. So for that reason, we created the Fair Lack Initiative, which is an initiative aimed at helping entrepreneurs develop responsible AI. And we have a self-assessment tool that helps entrepreneurs assess the risks associated or the limitations of the solutions that they are proposing. And with that, we use that tool in our pipeline to assess our investments, but also it's a digital public good that other entrepreneurs in the region can use to assess their own tools. And in that sense, we help mitigate the risks, the biases in AI systems.
It was great to hear about bias in AI and very practical solutions for how to mitigate that. Wenhui, I want to come back to you. You already talked about women factory workers and your engagement with them, especially about focusing on channels, so not only the products, but where to reach them and how. Can you add more of your experience in driving engagement with women customers?
Well, one of the very famous statements from our previous national leader, right? They say, woman holds half of the sky, right? Actually, I think in China, woman holds even more than half of the sky, right? But put the joke aside, I think first of all, when we build things, we should not say we specially do certain things for this segment or the others, but we should ensure the accessibility to make sure this is easier to use and it's easier to understand, and we don't have to do that much custom educations, so that our, let's say, especially for, well, whether it's female users or male users, they would be able to pick up quickly. They have their own independence, right? They don't have to depend on that much others in order to get education so that they can start. So that's on the accessibility. Right. The other ones, of course, we need to look at what are the areas, particularly if we want to drive the women's economy. Right. We need to think about what are the things they need or could potentially help. One of the good example could be on the e-commerce areas. Right. Actually, the e-commerce areas does create a lot of new jobs, so-called. And in these particular areas, I would say the ladies play a quite major role. They don't necessarily run a very big shop, but they are able to make a good life to support their families. And then our job is how can we leverage our technologies, make our product and service better so that we can serve them, right? We can help them to make their business even better. It may not be, again, a huge business, but every small, tiny business matters. Right? We understand the burden on the ladies' shoulders is pretty heavy. Right? Usually they would play a very important role to support the families. They may also need to, besides the money part, they may also need to take care of the families on the other things. They may need to have a bit more flexibility on the time. So these are all the considerations when we are building our product and services. We want to make sure we would be able to serve ladies better.
Thank you. So I have one more question I'll address to the panel, but I want to give you time as they're responding to think of your own questions. We would love to hear from you. So please get ready and we'll come back to you in a few minutes. So now I want to turn to the topic of consumer protection. In this panel, we've talked about a lot of the possibilities of inclusion that come from new technologies and how we leverage them. We also started talking about the risks. But Tudi, how do you think we can use and leverage technology to mitigate the risks? And as Robert said before, then even arise.
So we talk about underserved, but we never said actually who is behind. Who are those people we are talking about? The recent studies are saying that the underserved usually are those people, I will say a quarter of them, don't have a degree, a high school degree, okay? The other big part of underserved people are those that are coming from low income. So those are the people we are talking about, and we want to protect them. So I've limited education. I don't have much in terms of income. You want to protect me. The only way to protect me is to use laws, right? It is through the law. And the law will give me a right. The consumer protection law is to give me a right to choose, a right to accept, a right to be protected. And the untold story, even if you have technology behind, is how can the laws be enforced? Again, I'm looking at the perspective of Africa here. And I want to take an example of one country, Rwanda. So I spent 12 years in Singapore, amazing. Then I went to Rwanda, super amazing. And a few things for me that are very important, because women also are a topic that we want to talk about. I think in Singapore you have like 47% of women. And in Rwanda we have something like 50-50. I do believe, and I can be wrong, that when someone has to write a law, usually he will look at himself or herself before writing it. Okay? We want to write a law on consumer protection. But if the law, man, is written by men, you agree with me that we might forget something specific about women. And why did I bring Rwanda into the picture? Because Rwanda is the first country in the world with a parliament where the majority of MPs are women, 61%. Okay? 61% of MPs in Rwanda are women. They developed a law on consumer protection. They developed a law on data protection. They are advanced on that front. And those laws, where I said it is important, is how they are now enforced. Singapore, Rwanda, enforcement of law, Rwanda is in the top 5 on the continent. Singapore the same, worldwide. So technology is then possible to actually make an impact, because whatever the system you put behind, if it is not respected, you know that a law will be there. I don't want to say much, but in terms of development of the relevant tools now to protect the consumers, there is a big need for an economy which is growing. In Africa, the online economy will represent 180 billion in 2 years. But who is there now to play the role of protecting the consumers? So I want just the public to know, to remember 2 things. One, the underserved, we know who they are. Second, if we want to help them, we need to have the right framework, the right people taking the decision, and we need to have solid laws actually that will back the technology. Because technology alone will not give the solution.
Robert, I know you have a lot to say here.
Yeah, I'm kind of itching. I'm itching here.
Let's go.
Because this is a very interesting use case for tech. Because what we're really talking here is about a hypothesis. You described a hypothesis of gender-driven legislative bias. Now, it's a hypothesis because it's anecdotal. You have one instance. But imagine if you had a comprehensive database of all the legislation, and you could have that as a data set and combine it with the gender composition of legislators by country, and now you can, because now you have data, and now you can start to do some analysis to understand if there really is systemic bias that's gender-driven in legislation. And if you have that, then you have power because you've shown a light on a systemic bias that's credible. Because it's interesting that you've described that, but a rigorous audience that would take an opposing point of view and would say, no, 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 I mean, come on, that's just a one-off. You come to the table with data, credible analysis, using AI, using analytics. It's hard to ignore that then. And I think this is the thing, is that data and analytics, the tools are so sophisticated that you can actually underpin evidentially. You can shine lights on things that can drive change. And I think that's really important.
Thank you. let's hear now from the audience. Please raise a hand if you have a question. We have a person right at the back in the middle, and we have folks that are running microphones. And we'll take 2 questions, so maybe 2 hands now. We'll hear the questions and we'll go from there.
Hi, thank you. My question is for Robert, especially since you mentioned fraud. So I'm from Ghana, where mobile money has essentially changed the financial services ecosystem. But like you said, we have a lot of fraud that is undermining the work that has been done. Now, since we are talking about technology, is it possible that in the design of whatever technology tools for the underserved, we need to have an eye out for how to simplify it such that it can't be exploited? So then most of the cases of fraud we are having are for the older generation who were more of the late adopters to this technology, and trust is now being eroded. So one, could the design of the technology be contributing to this? I would like to know what your thoughts are. And secondly, when we come to the regulator bit, because you mentioned that you mentioned a few alternatives, I then have a question of if, for instance, in my context, chatbots and stuff may be the way to go, or a different simplified approach would also help there. That's the first question. I have a follow-up. I don't know if you want to answer before
Can I take that one first, because it might help frame your follow-up? So I mentioned the Subtech Lab, and it's about convening regulators to create public goods of new supervisory tools that do this kind of predictive capability, provide a feedback channel. I mentioned chatbots, right? There's 3 jurisdictions globally driving that, right, that are actually driving those proofs of concept. One is Peru, another one is the Philippines, and the third is Ghana.
Interesting.
Interesting.
Okay.
So Ghana, the regulator in Ghana, the supervisor, is deeply engaged in this. Now, I wanted to mention that because that might frame your second question, okay? And by the way, your point about interface based on segmented demographics in the UX, and how do people, given older people versus, which relates back to who are these people, right?
Yeah.
You have to address something that they can engage with and access, like really, and that's a lot of UX design. So your point on that is very good, but I'll let you go with your follow-up.
So my second question.
Sorry to interrupt. So we talk about regulator.
Yeah.
We talk about data, financial, technology. Which regulator are we talking about? Is it the telco regulator or is it the financial regulator?
Financial in this case.
Okay, because what I see as a potential issue at the moment, the telcos have been a bit in the middle, especially with mobile money. And it's only now that they are starting to actually set up specific dedicated entities that are within the financial regulatory framework in which fraud is, I would say, more difficult rather than in the telco space where they can still play saying, okay, I have my regulator, but the financial transaction happening there is not so much into the radar, I will say, of the financial regulator. And then we can go back to the financial regulator. How is he equipped actually to look at those millions of transactions happening at the mini small amount in the technology space? So I think we have, again, about data, there is a big space here where so much can be done looking at the data from the telcos. But sorry, I interrupted you.
Fantastic. So I'm actually going to cut the follow-up question so we have time to wrap up. But thank you so much for your input. So to summarize where we've been with this discussion, we started with the power of data. how we can leverage it to drive innovation in the financial sector, in non-financial players that are entering the financial sector. We really thought about who we are doing that for very deeply in terms of who are the underserved, what do they need, and how can we use their needs to build where we're going. And finally, we talked about risks, the role of regulators, and how the whole ecosystem comes together. This is the current state. The very last question I have for our panel is really looking forward. So I want a very specific use case of a technology you see emerging that might not have hit the market yet, that you think will really revolutionize how we are able to serve the underserved and what all of us should be looking out for in the future. Let's start with Wenhui.
Sure, okay, why not? Well, if we talk about the technologies, well, there are so many things in the so-called payment areas, right? So I would mention just one area about the cross-border. And this is actually what I'm working on, right? If we think about the technology itself, one thing we follow up quite closely is on the DLT, so-called distributed ledger technology, right? Why so? Because actually it could potentially significantly improve the transparency, efficiency, and also reduce the cost of the overall cross-border systems. But of course, it shouldn't be only the technology play a role, but also the other parts, especially how can we increase inclusivity or connectivities across the border, right? As what we are doing. So we open up our networks, right? As what we announced in the middle of the year. We allow all the international cards to be bound into Weixin, and then you can make a payment just as a local in the country. We open up our network for all the remittance into the country, right? And many more things are coming. So I think overall, technology plays a significant role, and it's not only the technology, but also the cooperation across the whole industry. That's my last one, yeah.
Robert?
Well, I'm going to go with the easy answer because I do think it's Gen AI. The problem is it's such a double-edged. So imagine that you have a financial transaction trust co-pilot, right, where you don't have necessarily a lot of education. There's stuff you just don't know. And, you know, frankly, if you're my age and you don't have the financial education, you probably don't have enough time to really learn it. And so you need help. You need an assistant. But that increases the vulnerability because if that assistant gets hacked, if that's what you're trusting, whoa. So it's that double-edged sword problem of what is very powerful on one side is very powerful on the other side.
So in terms of technology, I think we are, in a way, distancing ourselves from the real people. But the next technology for me is the one on biometrics, where me not having the money to buy this or to buy any equipment, I would like to be able to transact with anything, my fingers, my eyes. So I believe that the next technology will be everything implemented through biometrics.
Interesting, yeah. I think embedded technologies has a huge future, but also it's a double-edged sword because then your most intimate data will be, you know, out there. And so we have to be really careful with I think there's huge potential for embedded computing and in particular brain-computer interfaces, but it has to be, we need a lot of work into the ethics of this. And a quick thing that I think that in the next few years is going to have a lot of impact is the combination of Web3 and artificial intelligence, generative artificial intelligence, because it's going to unlock the potential of a myriad new services and allow us to create value out of the tokenization of all sort of things. And this is going to create a new economy that could power underserved communities.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you. And please join me in giving a round of applause for our fantastic panel. And I want to thank you all for joining us today. Have a fantastic rest of their summit.